So happy Friday, everyone, and happy New Year. Welcome to the first forum of the spring semester, and it's going outside right now. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Justin Baker. Justin is an associate professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources, and he's also a center faculty fellow. In addition, Justin wears many other hats. He's the director of the Southern Forest Resource Assessment Consortium. He directs the Resource Economics and Sustainability Lab at NC State. He's a faculty affiliate with the Center for Environmental and Resource Economic Policy, a research theme lead for the NSF Science and Technologies for Phosphorus Sustainability Center. That's a mouthful. And he holds a guest researcher affiliation with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Justin's research combines structural economic models and geospatial to capture spatial and temporal dependencies between markets, natural resource systems, infrastructure, and policy construction. Take it away.
Okay, so that's great. So there's gonna be a fun talk, a little bit of a walk through the woods, if you will, on several different projects that my lab is involved in or leading up. I have to say, I don't get nervous doing these kind of talks anymore, but something about CGA, the quality of the science is always super high, the really compelling visuals, insanely cool maps. You're not gonna get that today, I'm sorry. You're just gonna have to muddle through with what a standard economist thinks are compelling visuals. So anyway, it is what it is, but I'm here to talk a little bit, or at least to introduce this concept of how we integrate bottom-up geospatial information into what I'm calling natural resource economic models, right? So these are typically optimization or simulation models that we can use to conduct trade-off analysis, perform scenario modeling, and really ask normative, big picture policy questions at broad scales, global, national, regional, or to understand the effect of different management interventions under changing environmental conditions at a very local scale, right? So natural resource economics covers the gauntlet. Modeling covers spatial scope from the very local to global, and I'll provide some examples of both. This is meant to be more of a discussion, a walk through the woods, like I said. So definitely stop me if you have questions. I'm gonna kind of go through things pretty quickly, but it's really a pleasure to be here on Friday afternoon. Thanks for giving up some of your pre-happy hour time. All right, so some motivation here. So some questions that are kind of guiding this presentation, this general overview on how we build and apply these types of frameworks and why they're useful. How has my career led me to integrate more spatial information into economic models, right? So I'll try to cover that. Some of the motivation for ways we're doing things differently now than we were 5-10 years ago in the economic modeling space. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the role of geospatial analytics and kind of the scientific frontier of economic modeling, and where I think in this last question, kind of where I think the community is heading and how I think we're going to be able to integrate and improve spatial information from remote sense products, LiDAR, et cetera, into really nice decision support frameworks represented either local or regional scales. All right, so with that, a little bit of background. So I grew up in West Texas. I became motivated in natural resource economics early on in college. I was working on a degree in kind of international economics, finance, and math. I was going to go work for a bank. And then like halfway through my junior year, I heard a random guest lecture on the economic value of water. And I was just hooked, right? It just blew me away. This idea that you could apply economic tools and concepts in a way to think about the value of these resource assets that provide so much to society and are being in a lot of contexts very mismanaged, right? So I grew up in West Texas. It's a semi-arid, water scarce region. You have aquifers connected to the Ogallala system that are drying up due to overexploitation historically. A lot of mineral extraction right now that's also affecting water quality and availability, right? So the water challenges there are huge, and that's kind of what got me motivated and interested in this space early on. And I was fortunate enough to hook up with an advisor at Texas Tech University for a master's degree who introduced me to this concept of systems modeling, right? So building dynamic economic systems to answer kind of normative forward-looking policy questions about how should we be managing these resources, or what would the costs and benefits of different policy interventions or management interventions be to help us conserve water more effectively. So that kind of got me into it. I went off to Texas A&M to work on my PhD. Spent 2 years in College Station. They didn't like me there because I was a Red Raider, grew up in Lubbock. So if you're not from Texas, you're not gonna understand, I get it. But about halfway through my PhD program, I got an opportunity to move out to Duke University, to Durham, to do a pre-doc. And so I spent the next several years finishing my PhD program remotely, while working at the Nicholas Institute for Environment, Energy, and Sustainability. Back in those days, it was environmental policy solutions. After that, I spent about 9 years at RTI International. How many of you are familiar with RTI? Okay, so really a kind of nice local research and consulting organization here in the Triangle, kind of the first institution in Research Triangle Park. They do a lot of exciting work. They're often hiring for folks with the kind of background that the CGA programs provide. I've been on the faculty since 2020. In addition to some of the affiliations, one thing I did want to mention, the college is starting a new initiative called the Forest Carbon Solutions Initiative that we hope to engage students and faculty in moving forward. Okay, so why, or broadly what I'm interested in, where a lot of my kind of career has advanced over the past several years is thinking about the role of applied economics in interdisciplinary and convergence research. Right, so convergence research is this new kind of NSFE buzzword. It's the ability to take interdisciplinary perspectives, bring them together in a way that creates new languages, new processes, new ways of thinking about wicked problems. And applied economics plays a really important role. And I find that as an economist on large interdisciplinary teams, overcoming that disciplinary language barrier or that disciplinary bias in the way we think about particular problems becomes a really, really big challenge. Just kind of getting on the same page at the outset of working on a new problem is challenging. So I spend a lot of my time there. I also do the basic modeling work that my lab does is focused on integrated systems approaches, primarily around societal challenges, right? Environmental change, climate change, and thinking about potential trade-offs between the sustainable development goals. Okay. I don't want to spend much time here, but I would say, our projects in the lab kind of span between 4 quadrants. Kind of agricultural sector research, forest sector research, kind of land use change modeling, and water resource management. So I would say where I'm going to focus a little bit more of my time today, because I never really get to talk about the water work that our lab is doing. So I'm going to give a couple of examples on some of the forest-oriented carbon work that we're doing, but I'm going to spend more of my time here around food, energy, water nexus, sustainability challenges, and how we apply models to think about potential interventions or management solutions to some of the water scarcity challenges that we face. So we model, when I say model, again, this could be many different scales, everything from kind of local decision support framework of how do we manage this particular plot if we want to jointly produce timber, carbon, and biodiversity from the same forest stand, all the way up to kind of big picture national and global scale modeling. Kind of in the middle here, though, is another area of research where we spend a lot of time in the lab, and that's on spatial empirical analysis, right? And that's where we rely a lot on collaborators and institutions like CGA that help us kind of work with and consume spatial data sets in our statistical analyses to understand the influence of spatial varying factors on land management or resource management decisions that are being made. And that can help us kind of inform the development of our structural models. I would say that the reason I think you could be disappointed maybe in parts of this talk is that I'm not what I would call a spatial scientist, right? I am a consumer of spatial information, right? I have to work with collaborators that have the skills that you all have to produce the kind of inputs that fit into our structural models. So I'm always really grateful for the opportunity to work and collaborate with folks in CGA who bring some of those skills to the table. Okay. What is, or why is natural resource economic modeling kind of gaining some popularity? Really, I would say over the past decade or so, these kind of structural modeling efforts, integrated systems approaches to global challenges have mostly gained popularity due to climate change, right? And so why might that be? Why they want to speculate? So from a policy and an economic perspective, if we want to think about climate change, we're doing so in a very forward-looking way. That's one aspect, right? We're talking long-term changes that we need to model to try to understand the potential impact of. The other aspect here is that a lot of the policy interventions or the management solutions, the technology solutions that we talk about in a climate change context, do they exist right now? No, right? There's often no empirical basis for conducting causal inference or applying kind of standard statistical methods to think about the impact of interventions that have been applied in the past on improving climate outcomes, right? So we often have to build more normative scenarios to try to project long-term adoption of new technologies or the effectiveness of different policy interventions on achieving some climate goal, be that an emissions reduction threshold or some level of increased carbon uptake in natural ecosystems or whatever the case might be, right? So due to the fact that we're often dealing with speculative or normative policies, technologies, interventions, that's, I think, made these kind of integrated systems approaches more popular again. And it's led to a lot more funding recently, right? So it started about a decade ago with the innovations at the Nexus of Food, Energy, and Water Systems, which is an NSF and the NIPA program. That led to the next generation, which was the Coupled Natural and Human Systems program, which led to the next generation, which is the DICE's or Dynamic Integrated Socio-Environmental Systems program, also funded by NSF. And then DICE is ongoing, but we also have the Convergence Research Accelerator, which is another opportunity to kind of bring these applied economic modeling methods to the table for collaborative grant proposals. So why spatial information, right? So back in the when I got my start in this, 2008, 2009, we were writing papers at the time to help support policy dialogue around the first and last comprehensive climate bill that actually went to a vote in the House of Representatives back in 2009. Anybody remember what that was called? You're not ancient like me, so probably not. It was the Waxman-Markey bill, HR 2454, and it died a pretty quick death once it got to the Hill for a vote. But before that, there was a lot of research and impact assessment work being done by the EPA and other federal agencies to understand the costs and benefits of this climate bill. And so at the time, we were running scenarios to try to understand potential trade-offs. If we're going to be introducing incentives into our forestry and agricultural sector domestically, that is going to introduce this new competition for land, pay people to sequester more carbon on their land through improved forest management and afforestation, that could induce some trade-off, right? That could actually lead to a reduction in the amount of land available for agriculture because we're putting so much land into trees. And what that does is it has an implication for markets. It's driving up prices. It's driving down U.S. exports of agricultural commodities. So these are kind of important and meaningful food security concerns that came up as a result of some of these analyses. But, at the time, we're kind of applying the best of the best that we could apply. But this sort of leaves you with a feeling that it's not quite a complete story, right? Because back in 2009, 2010, economists who were working in the modeling space didn't do a lot to understand or address distributional outcomes of policy, right? So, and by what I mean by that is how a price change or broad changes in land use would affect different households, different regions of the country, of the world differently, and what populations, what communities might be more or less vulnerable to those systematic shocks, right? So one of the things that I've liked about this proliferation of spatial data is it's really improved our ability to think about and to model potential distributional outcomes of policy choices, right? And so that's kind of the bullet in the middle here. And we're able to do that by representing a wider range of costs and benefits associated with different policy incentives, associated with different management strategies, and incorporate that into our models in a way that gives us improved information on how these policies might impact vulnerable communities. The other thing that I'll talk about at the very end, something I'm really excited about, kind of the frontier, a lot of the systems modeling is thinking both globally and locally and connecting global and local systems. And I'll come back to that. All right, so first I'm gonna talk a little bit about forest carbon, just briefly. So this is a new paper, new working paper led by a PhD student, Madison Fuller. Something we're really excited about. And so here, you know, motivated by a lot of the dialogue, has anybody heard about the Trillion Tree Initiative? This idea that we need to invest in planting as many trees as possible across the globe because that's gonna sequester more carbon and help us mitigate climate change. Well, so we wanted to understand, we want to go a little bit deeper than some of the modeling studies that are US focused that are out there have done to look at potential tree planting or more broadly forest expansion investments that could be made given kind of fixed federal budgets akin to recent policies like the Replant Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, and understand the potential spatial distribution of where we're likely to see the most carbon. So here, this is a huge, huge budget. We said, what if the federal government threw $50 billion at tree planting or forest expansion programs? This is the amount of carbon that you would get. And the spatial units of analysis that we're using are census tracts, right? That's why there's these kind of small shapes in some locations and really big shapes in others, because smaller shapes correspond to what? Denser populations, exactly. So we're working with census tract data, NLCD land cover data, reforestation hub information, spatially delineated forest growth and yield curves for different forest types. And that results in an economist's spatial visual that looks like this. The other map that I wanted to show here, other studies of afforestation, forest expansion opportunities have been focused a lot on the types of trees, the types of forests that we should be expanding given a carbon policy. And so this just shows kind of the spatial extent of forest types, the dominant forest type that we might see in some of these planting efforts. And so this is over kind of a 30-year simulation timeframe with a $50 billion budget. We see a lot of, compared to a shorter timeframe and a smaller budget where we see mostly planted pine, we see actually a lot of natural pine and a natural regeneration oriented forest expansion strategies in this case, as opposed to the shorter timeframe, which is dominated by plantations. Okay, so the thing that I'm really excited about here, that I want to focus on for this crowd, is we are taking this model a step further to think about distributional implications of forest expansion opportunities. Or maybe not, maybe that's the wrong way to phrase it. We're thinking about potential trade-offs between competing policy objectives, right? So in the climate space, the climate finance space, in the federal government, rightfully, there is an emerging focus on equitable allocation of climate financial resources. And so programs like IRA, the Replant Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure, blah, 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 blah Act, I forget what it's called. There's an emphasis on allocating a certain amount of funding to vulnerable communities. And so in this figure, what we've done is we've taken our different kind of forest expansion budget, and we have looked at different kind of proportional budget requirements, you know, allocating X% of that budget to environmental justice communities, which we define using an EPA, kind of a standard EPA definition of EJ communities. We identify which census tracts fall into that. And then we can actually run a bunch of scenarios to develop these trade-off frontiers, right? So here on the y-axis, we've got the additional carbon storage coming as a result of our forest expansion policy. On the x-axis, we've got the proportion of total budget allocated to EJ communities, and you can actually see this interesting trade-off frontier emerge. And so the one takeaway here is we can get about We get up to about 15% of our budget allocated to EJ communities in a tree planting or a forest expansion program without inducing really any trade-off in terms of the amount of additional carbon stored, right? That's a pretty important finding for policymakers. We did the same kind of thing, only looking at some ecological considerations, water and fire risks, so limiting forest expansion and zones. This requires some additional spatial analysis and kind of incorporation of bottom-up spatial inputs into the model. And here we saw also very minimal trade-offs, less than kind of 4 to 5% across the board relative to our baseline when we limit forest expansion in high water risk zones and high fire risk zones. So, a lot of the point there being that a lot of the baseline kind of forest expansion that we find is happening in low risk areas anyway. Okay, so market modeling. This is some work led by Gaurav Dungal, who's our PhD student, forest economist extraordinaire. And I want to talk a little bit about hardwood management, because I think this is another area, tons of potential to integrate bottom-up spatial information with kind of broad scale regional economic modeling. So here in this study, we're incorporating inputs from the Spatially Explicit Forest Inventory and Analysis database, which some of you have probably worked with. This involves pulling in kind of plot level information. Here you can see our white oak growing region, often referred to as the Central Hardwoods region, and the shade of these different plots at the different points in the FI database is an indicator of the proportion of those forests that's dominated by oak. And so we can use that information to build up kind of a total estimate of initial inventory by, I don't want to say age class, this is diameter class, like how large the tree is. All right, so what were we interested in this particular study? We want to identify market tipping points. So we build up all these spatial information into a regional model, and we want to understand what levels of growth in markets for white oak specifically would induce a critical tipping point. By a tipping point, I mean the point at which inventory tips and all of a sudden starts to decline in a region, right? So in a lot of these scenarios, you'll see we do have white oak inventory growing for a period of time, and then we hit a tipping point. And that point in time where we start to see a decline in inventory corresponds to the level of market growth. So these are the curves here. This is a paper that we published in the Journal of Forestry late last year. And the different lines, different shades here represent different percentage growth rates and white oak demand. And so each of these curves, you have an inflection point, a peak. And that is our kind of critical tipping point where all of a sudden we start to see collapse in inventory because inventory growth from natural region isn't able to keep up with market demand. Makes sense? Okay. We can look at this regionally as well to identify state by state where these tipping points might emerge and how that relates to overall market demand growth. Okay, but why do we care about this? Why is this important? Well, this gives us sort of one indicator that we need to communicate to policymakers, kind of the potential urgency of incentive structures to help forest managers navigate oak management in a time of environmental change, right? So I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's going on in hardwood forests in the Central Hardwoods region, but there's a large kind of transition happening where historically you've had fire and management that allowed these oak dominated forests really flourish. But due to a practice called high grading or kind of selective cutting, you see a lot more of the kind of high valued white oak being removed, and that is not regenerating in the understory. It's being replaced by mesophytes, beech, maple, etc. And this is problematic because this is a very valuable resource and supports local industries such as the bourbon industry in Kentucky. So the first part is to understand long-term market drivers, but to understand how policymakers can actually influence change, we need to dive a little deeper, and that's where spatial empirics come in. So I know this is an awful table to throw at a presentation like this, But I just wanted to make the point that we're at, where we're going with this is to think about the effect that historic management has had on mesification using FIA and a variety of other spatial factors. And that's kind of what we see in this table here, where we have a really strong and kind of significant positive effect of our partial harvest decision on the rate of mesophytes that we see at a plot level. And then we can mix that with what's called an economics random utility model, where we can look at alternative harvest or management choices that a forester can choose from to determine kind of their optimal management profile. And we find that indeed their optimal management profile is something resembling partial cutting to make sure that you're retaining amenity values associated with the forest. And what we end up with from this exercise is the ability to quantify what we're calling a willingness to accept measure, a willingness to accept compensation to avoid mesification via some management change. That could be more shelter wood cutting, that could be more clear cutting, that could be total forest preservation, but something that landowner could do differently to avoid this rapid environmental change that's happening. Okay, some other stuff that we do involves more spatial allocation modeling between FIA plots and facilities. And we do that via detailed transportation nodes. So we're able to really connect supply points and demand points via detailed transportation networks. And that helps us when we're developing carbon projections at either national or local scales. I've got some papers on that I can share if anybody's interested. Okay, so I'm gonna spend a few more minutes. Any questions before I move on? Supposed to be time for, yeah.
So when you say white oak, do you mean like Quercus alba, or you just mean like the group of white oaks in particular? It's like there's a white oak, and then there's, when you look at oaks, like there's black oaks, there's.
Oh, no, yeah, Quercus alba, it's just the white oak species.
And so then, like, do you account for changes in distribution of white oak, like over the years, like as temperature and everything changes? I don't know the exact distribution of white oak, but like I don't think it's going to stay stable in the region.
It's an excellent question. And so in the first study that we showed, no, right, we're kind of holding that composition fairly constant as you move through time and you're making your harvesting decisions. But in the empirical method, some of what's happened already, and that species composition change and that age class structure change is already sort of embedded within the statistical data set. Moving forward, we're going to be looking to incorporate mesification and mesophytic transitions into our baseline.
Yes. Can you repeat the question so it gets on the record?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the question was, to what extent are we accounting for the change in white oak structure over time, these environmental change forces into our baseline? And I said for the first study, we did not. Okay, spatially informed multi-sector approaches. All right, this is some stuff that I've been involved in for a while. We've done some work looking at trade-offs between different development priorities, right? So this is work in Guatemala. And really these types of frameworks are designed to bring together spatial information that you need to represent production and consumption choices in the energy sector and the food supply sector and in water resource systems. And so for this study, we coupled spatial information, insulation, wind speed, hydraulic head for reservoirs and run of the river systems, population density, the types of spatial metrics that we need to think about renewable energy costs and deployment potential. And so this is a spatially refined kind of renewable energy investment tool developed at RTI that helps us to estimate the LCOE, anybody, the levelized cost of energy for these different renewable energy sources in the Guatemalan context. And really the reason we wanted to build out this energy system framework is we wanted to understand potential trade-offs between really ambitious renewable energy goals that the country had imposed, and whether or not it might make it more difficult to alleviate energy poverty in Guatemala. Right? So there's a lot of households who face energy poverty, who face relatively high expenditures for energy as a portion of their household income. And so we wanted to understand what renewable energy investments at optimality might mean for these households. So in this figure here, want to focus a little bit, sorry, the type did not copy over well, so that's hard to read, and I apologize for that. But in panel C here, we have an indicator for energy poverty, and in panel D, we have a change in monthly electricity expenditure in the context of renewable energy expansion as driven by this national scale climate policy. And that can help us identify areas where energy poverty risk is greatest under these low carbon development pathways, right? So it's just an example of how we use spatial information coupled with economic modeling to think about trade-offs across development objectives. Land subsidence is a big one. So land subsidence or subsidence, I always say that word wrong in text and I mispronounce everything. So land subsidence is a major issue all over the world. In the US, we have subsidence occurring in the mid-Atlantic region, out on the West Coast, in the Gulf region. More than 80% of it is driven by overexploitation of groundwater resources, right? And so we wanted to build a framework that would couple kind of spatial information with simulation modeling, with household scale damage estimates, where we're moving forward in time and we're looking at how groundwater extraction affects whether or not a house is in a flood zone and what that means for property values, and to come up with some estimate of land subsidence damages in this case study region, which is basically coastal Virginia, right? So just really quickly here, this involves a lot of ugly math to reflect groundwater dynamics and spatial dependencies. It also involves estimating a statistical model we call a hedonic property valuation, where we're trying to quantify the marginal effect of whether or not a house is in a flood zone on housing values. We use that to estimate property damages. And then we couple this with a really simple but spatially refined intertemporal optimization model that helps us to kind of quantify those subsidence damages. But then we do one more thing and we say, okay, well, what if we could project the damages from land subsidence in this region, and we could define a perfect policy that would internalize those damages. What might that mean for the kind of spatial temporal distribution of groundwater over time in this region? And so we build a model with kind of primary pumping locations. The shades here represent relative subsidence levels over time or in the past. And remember, our population zone is mostly concentrated over here with really high levels of pumping at this node. So we build this model, we simulate pumping over time, and that gives us a change in whether or not a house is located in a flood zone, and that gives us damage to the property value of that individual parcel, and we can come up with an aggregate subsidence damage estimate of $7.86 billion over, I think it's a 7-year time frame. Now we can take that and say, okay, at the margin, what if we taxed every unit of groundwater that we extract by the damage, the subsidence damage that it would impose, right? It's kind of a common way of thinking about internalizing the environmental damages of something we don't want, right? It's called a Pigouvian tax. So when we do that, we end up with higher pumping costs overall, but a much larger kind of change in net damages, or a much reduced set of damages, especially in these urban zones where we see a lot of houses and we see high property values along the coastline. This was cool because they used the E-Trax data that Zillow put out and made publicly available for a very short window of time. They don't do that anymore. It's a shame. All right, I'm gonna wrap up with California, I think. So some things we're working on in California. Historically, the Central Valley has seen really high rates of groundwater extraction. And that has compelled the state to introduce SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. SGMA basically tells individual groundwater management districts within California, but mostly in the Central Valley where this is a problem, that they have to develop groundwater sustainability plans to improve the sustainability of the resource over time, make sure that they're conserving groundwater for future generations. It's fairly ambiguously defined, and a lot of the plans that have been developed by these districts have not been approved because they lack enforcement mechanism. So this is going to be an ongoing process for a long time, this development of these sustainability plans. And, you know, it's not helped by things like really, really high rainfall year like we had in 2022, 2023 in the valley, which all of a sudden took us from massive concerns over water shortages to, and we're okay for a while, right? So this is happening while at the same time, the state of California is pursuing the most ambitious state level climate action plan in the US. The goal of 100% clean energy by 2045. And this is gonna basically triple current grid capacity, including a lot of expansion in utility scale solar. Utility scale solar is going to require a lot of land, right? This isn't all going to be produced from rooftops. You're going to need large tracts of land devoted just to solar PV systems to produce this much energy. So this raises some important questions on where we're going to site this stuff. How does it conflict with, you know, if these are natural lands, how does it affect biodiversity? If these are working lands, what are the economic trade-offs? What are we giving up to produce solar in terms of food production? I didn't say this, but the valley produces about a third or more of the fruits and vegetables that we consume in this country. It is a very, very important agricultural region, right? All right, so we've got this confluence of policy factors, climate policy on one hand, groundwater sustainability on the other hand. How are they going to interact? We don't know. All right, well, let's bring a bunch of spatial data together and let's model it, right? And so one of the things I'm excited about here is, in addition to bringing in all this really cool kind of spatially informed agricultural sector data and region-wide renewable energy investment projections from our colleague Grace Wu at UC Santa Barbara, we're also using products that have been developed by MGIST students, including Scott Ellis. I'm really excited about to share this, right? This is an example of how a student project can actually result in an output that we can incorporate into our models. And so what Scott had done is he had taken a bunch of historic data on crop yields and had built a kind of vector of regressors, including physical factors, characteristics, and other kind of economic characteristics. Applied some machine learning to spatially interpolate what we're calling yield adjustment factors, right? This is basically just a parameter that tells us the relative quality of agricultural land and how high the yield will be in a certain point in space. We've also done some work using really detailed monitoring well data from the state of California to do something very similar and spatially interpolate an estimate or kind of a full map of groundwater pumping depth across California, but you know, we're only really using what's in the valley. I'm gonna skip these slides. So what are we doing with this first paper? We're assessing potential solar expansion using kind of two different modeling frameworks, one which we call the central planner approach. This is where you have a policymaker who comes in and says, I know what's best for the Central Valley. Here's my objectives. Here's what the optimal allocation of land across energy, food production, and other uses should look like, versus a land manager, which is going to be a little bit more profit motivated, right? So we develop kind of an iterative feedback loop between these two different models because we're trying to kind of identify a convergent point where we get similar levels or similar areas of solar adoption, and then tell a story about how these two frameworks are different. And the reason we care about this is at the end of the day, we want to be able to identify likely hotspots for solar expansion and investment. But we also want to do a better job of understanding what the potential opportunity costs are, the environmental benefits are, and what the water resource impacts would be of replacing productive agricultural land with solar PV. Any questions on kind of where we're going with that? So this is sort of an agriculture nexus, so agriculture food nexus paper. Some takeaways. I didn't find that figure very compelling, so I'm not going to show it. We find that we end up with pretty high solar adoption rates in our central planner solution, especially when we're thinking about the climate benefits of solar. But it takes a really, really high incentive to get ag producers in the valley on board and to adopt or to, I guess, switch over from crop production and into solar. However, we do show that there is some complementarity here between restrictions on access to groundwater and the solar power incentives, these lease payments. So, you know, I mentioned that this confluence of climate and groundwater sustainability policies could complicate the story. In some respects, it sort of makes it simpler, as our results are showing. You know, limiting groundwater access maybe makes it easier to achieve your objectives on the renewable energy side. But maybe the key takeaway here is that we're only reallocating about 2% of total area, even under our most kind of ambitious scenario here on the solar side. And so the food security impacts, at least for the region, are pretty minimal. Can I take like 3 more minutes?
Yeah.
All right. So one more thing I'm super excited about. Our postdoc kind of generated these figures this week, so this is the first time I'm presenting it. You get to be my guinea pig audience, which is cool. But this is where I think a lot of this modeling work is headed, and that's identifying and trying to model real dependencies between scales, right? So how do changing global market conditions affect resource management choices and patterns at a local scale? And what is the kind of feedback loop that exists between those 2 scales? So here, we wanted to understand whether or not irrigation in US agriculture is a meaningful climate adaptation mechanism. And so what I mean by that is if we have climate change that's going to affect crop yields, how negative are those impacts, and can expanded irrigation or irrigation intensification help us overcome some of the negative effects of climate change? And then we're going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to project future climate change and look at changes in irrigation, water consumption. But then we want to know, is this really driven by climate change, or is this irrigation change driven by adjustments in the global market? So we want to decompose the trade effect from the irrigation effect. And that's going to give us our kind of global to local story that we think is pretty novel and hasn't really been looked at. All right, so what are we doing? Well, we're using a global model. So this is a global model that is, again, built up from the bottom up from really refined spatial inputs. And in here, we're looking at kind of 3 Earth system models and 3 representative concentration pathways, which are long-term scenarios of atmospheric CO2 accumulation and radiative forcing, which global climate models project and then use to generate spatially downscaled or bias-corrected estimates of changes in temperature and precipitation and other things that we care about. That information gets brought into crop models and water models to tell us something about water availability, crop water requirements, and potential crop yields under changing temperature and precipitation patterns in the future, right? So we bring all this stuff together and we develop these estimates of kind of changing crop yields and crop water requirements and water availability, incorporate all that in a spatially explicit way into this model global biome. And we use global biome to run scenarios. These 8.5, 7.0, 2.5, these are different RCP climate scenarios, and then we've got our 3 different Earth systems models that we're looking at. And so what we see in the US context is for all of these scenarios, we're increasing irrigation area, right? The amount of area that is actively irrigated in our crop production system is increasing overall. That's a pretty strong signal that under climate change, irrigation could be a pretty key adaptation mechanism. But what's interesting when we dig a little deeper is that you know, the irrigation intensity story isn't as clear. We're actually reducing the amount of water applied per acre, right? So increasing the extensive margin, the amount that we're irrigating, but maybe decreasing the intensity due to lower water requirements for specific crops. Then we can look at kind of the spatial distribution of sort of where we might expect changes in irrigation. And so we start to see some losses or some movement out of the Corn Belt and the lower Great Plains for irrigated area. We start to see irrigation expanding into regions like the Southeast, like the Pacific Northwest, even parts of the Northeast where we are expected to have relatively higher water availability. So it's kind of tracks with where climate projections are going. But the kind of cool punchline here is when we get to this figure, this is where I wanted to close, 'cause I'm excited about it. We can actually decompose the irrigation response to climate change from the trade-oriented response, right? So what's happening when you run these big global models is you can't just think about the one physical phenomena happening at a local scale, you know, changes in temperature, precipitation, and water availability. You have to think about this globally connected market. And so what's happening in these model scenarios is the US is actually dictating a higher comparative advantage in food production under climate change than it is under the baseline. And so it expands its export share to the global market, right? So under climate, let me say that a different way. Under climate change, prices globally go up because there's a lot of regions that see adverse impacts on crop yields. And because prices go up and because the US is relatively, you know, better off under climate change agriculturally, they export more. And so we can actually decompose what we're showing here, which is the effect of climate change on water consumption, where for some crops we see, you know, some crops and some, these are scenarios on the x-axis, for some combination of crops and scenarios, we see an increase in water applied under climate change. But then for, you know, corn, grain, and other cereals, we see for a large number of these scenarios, actual reduction in water applied. The trade results tell a different story. Here, for most of these crops, we actually see a big increase in water applied due to the trade effect, right? So what does this mean? Well, it means that the shifting kind of market conditions that we see under climate change are more important in explaining the response that we see in the US food system in terms of total irrigation than the climate impact itself. We'll close there. Just say that, you know, moving forward, there's a lot of opportunities to incorporate more spatial data into these economic tools, especially if we want to think about land sharing solutions or resource management intensity. One thing that I think we're just kind of scratching the surface on in economic models is improving the temporal dimension of our models, right? We often operate at a annual, multi-year, decadal, sometimes time step. A lot of ecological processes don't, right? They operate on a sub-annual time step, and we need to be thinking about improving the spatial, or I'm sorry, the temporal dimension of our models in addition to the spatial dimension. And then finally, one area where I'd love to collaborate more is thinking about leveraging spatial information to conduct more rapid impact assessment after a natural hazard event, linking economic models to quantify damages and identify hotspots for quick turnaround interventions. That's all I got. Sit down now.
Well, there's time for questions. Anyone want to start out?
Yeah, you had the substance in Virginia, and I wasn't sure I got the final punchline there. It was a cost per gallon of water. What would that cost be per gallon of water being a tax?
I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it'd be whatever the 7 billion in damage.
So the numbers up there were billions. That was 0.43
Yeah, that's right. That's
billion
right.
over the whole
basin.
Annually, or
No, over the like 50-year time frame. It's a
Okay.
50-year because we went out to, I said 70-year, but we went out to 2070, so it's a 50-year.
so kind of ballpark. Is it a reasonable tax? Is it a ridiculous tax?
It's any price on water is going to be a ridiculous tax from a political perspective, but in terms of the actual cost, it's not substantial relative to the actual pumping costs that these water managers already face.
Okay.
Less than 10%.
Okay.
So my question was about that too. I just didn't quite understand. So you're saying like the whole, like the idea would be the owners of the properties would be paying tax on water?
No, this would be the water managers, right? So in some respects, everybody would pay this because if the public bears the cost of additional cost of water in a municipal water supply system, then the public would bear some share of the cost here. Now, this is a really interesting question because a lot of those points are industrial facilities as opposed to public drinking water systems. And so this makes me think we need to look a little bit more into the distribution of those costs across kind of industry versus homeowners. That's a good point. We were sort of thinking about it as the public shares these costs, but that's a really good point. That wouldn't necessarily be the case. Yeah.
I have a question about the California work and the solar. Is there all your work is focused on the Central Valley, which is
Yeah.
great for agricultural production. There's a lot of land in California that's desert and
Yeah.
isn't used for that. Is there a reason why California or your research was focused on the Central Valley versus high desert areas in Southern California?
Great question. So I would say it's kind of two things. One, the grant is focused on the Central Valley. So that's part of it. And the solar potential that we estimate with this energy systems model, this is a small share of the total land projected as being, high potential for solar generation. And so some of the key characteristics there, you need to think about the potential from a physical standpoint. So looking at solar radiation, days with cloud cover, physical parameters like that. But you also need to look at proximity to load centers or distribution centers and the cost of trunk lines or spur lines to actually transport the energy and distribute it. So those distribution costs become really important and kind of weeding out some locations. If that makes sense.
How far can that be transported? Like,
I mean, I think infinitely if you pay for it, I guess. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not an engineer on that. Like an electrical engineer.
working on like, because you mentioned the desert, are people working on like figuring out how to install these things in the least damaging way to all the existing?
This is a nascent area of research, but there's a lot of emphasis on siting and siting in a way that in particular isn't damaging to biodiversity, which is why I think it is actually kind of reasonable to if we run out of desert land in close proximity to load centers or populations, to think about some of these agricultural fields which have declining aquifers, lower productivity or whatever. These might be good candidates for temporary 30-year leases that would replenish aquifers and whatever.
What did you call the tax? You said
Piguvian.
what?
That's a Piguvian tax.
Bagubian.
Yeah.
I have a list of words that I learned from you today.
That's great. It's happening in real time. I love it.
Anyone else?
How do you balance being an economist and like thinking about the economic factors of everything along with all of the other additional factors that we would be considering in terms of the environment and like ecology? Like how do you balance if it would cost a little bit more to be sustainable? Like how do you have those conversations and balance them as an economist?
Well, so this is where I would punt and say, well, I just do the analysis and that's the policymaker's job. But when I have these conversations, I try to remind folks that the reason we do this kind of work is that it really is fundamentally about understanding those trade-offs, right? And so if we want to use a model like this to insert more rigidity or kind of higher performance standards on the environmental side, we can absolutely do that and then see what the resulting consequences are for kind of total economic value from our resource system. It's a great question. Yeah.
It's kind of related to that. I guess outside of publishing, what are some of the channels of communication to policymakers?
Nobody listens to us. So sorry, that was tongue in cheek, but I would say that on the kind of national and global scale modeling, we talk a lot with EPA, with USDA. There's similar conversations that other modelers have with the Department of Energy, agencies that are sort of involved in kind of the development or the implementation of new programs, standards, policy measures, who want to understand what, in particular, some of the unintended consequences or the potential unintended consequences of these policy actions might be, right? So a lot of this work gained popularity in like 2007, post 2007, when the Energy Information and Security Act was passed, which imposed the renewable fuel standard, the large ethanol mandates. And that led to a big increase in interest in these types of frameworks as a means for estimating potential indirect land use change emissions associated with US biofuel policy, right? I would say that these models, a lot of the work that I do on the kind of national scale and global scale forestry with collaborators, we actually get to see represented in our UNFCCC communications that come out from the federal government, right? So some of the kind of forward-looking projections of LULUCF emissions come from these types of economic models. That's pretty exciting to see. I haven't figured out how to talk to folks in local context though, and get buy-in. Yeah, still a challenge. Yeah.
It's not a question, more so just a comment. There are a couple of things going through my mind right now. So yesterday, the libraries had an event looking at climate change in the movies. And so we talked about like, Don't Look Up, and how a lot of times just about how, well, even when we present the data and the numbers and everything, the policymakers, the managers, they still kind of move slowly on making the decisions. Your first, I don't know if it was just me, but the first project you talked about with White Oak, the numbers, the years seemed where we started to see the decline seemed to be rapidly approaching.
Yeah.
So it was just a little, it gave my heart a little jump to think about, like, we are rapidly approaching those dates where we're about to start seeing those declines, and then we are going to be faced with the, like, what do we do? Like, we're in these crucial few years right before we see some of those changes, it seems.
It's a really great point. And I guess, some maybe some words of comfort on the White Oak study, at least, where those were really, really high demand growth scenarios where we saw the tipping points over the next, couple of decades under kind of business as usual, 50+ years, and in a lot of cases before we see major concerns. But it's a point well taken. And I struggled with this a little bit in some of the work that I've done previously on groundwater management, where the challenges aren't 20 years out there right now, right? We're imposing high social costs in the way we manage this resource right now, and sort of communicating that and influencing change isn't always easy.
Yeah, I really appreciate this presentation because I don't often get an opportunity to think about this in the economic context, and it is very important that we pair the economics with the research that we're doing to kind of, it definitely hits home in a different way, I think.
Politicians provide some information.
Yes, that as well. So just saying, like, I wish when I was taking my economics classes as an undergrad, it was more in the natural resource kind of lens, I guess.
It's always in our 500.
I'm done with that now.
It's like there might be a question in the chat.
Oh, comment? It's a comment.
No.
Not related to this.
Distracted by my moving around. Probably. So, sorry for folks on Zoom.
Anyone else? Let's give Justin a final round of applause.
Is anybody in the room, if you're in CGA, Ross Wintermeyer, his dad